I was 8 years old when my dad walked out on us. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. My mom was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, and I was playing with some Legos on the living room floor. Dad came in from work, looking more tired than usual. He didn't even say hello. Just went straight to his room, grabbed a bag, and left. No explanation, no goodbye. At the time, I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe he was just going away for a little while, that he'd be back in a few days, maybe a week. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it became pretty clear that he wasn't coming back. Mom tried to be strong for me, but I could see how hard it was on her. She picked up extra shifts, working long hours to make ends meet, but even that wasn't enough. We had to move out of our house because we couldn't afford the mortgage anymore. We ended up in a tiny apartment on the other side of town, and I had to switch schools. Everything changed so fast, and it felt like my whole world had fallen apart. I had a lot of anger back then. I couldn't understand how my dad could just leave us like that. No calls, no letters, no visits. It was like he had disappeared off the face of the earth. For a long time, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't a good enough son. Maybe I did something to make him leave. But as I got older, I started to realize that none of this was my fault. My dad made his choice, and that choice was to abandon his family. I didn't need him. My mom and I were doing just fine without him. Or at least that's what I told myself. Fast forward 20 years, and life had pretty much settled into a routine. I'd moved out, got my own place, and was working a decent job. My relationship with my mom was solid, and I'd made peace with the fact that my dad was never coming back. It wasn't something I thought about much anymore. That was until I got a message from him out of the blue. It was a random Tuesday night, and I was scrolling through my phone, half watching some show on Netflix, when I saw the notification. An email from a name I hadn't seen in 2 decades, Robert M. My stomach dropped. I had to read the message 3 times before it really sunk in. Hey, my name, it's your dad. I know it's been a long time, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I'd love to reconnect and explain everything. Please let me know if you're open to meeting up. Love, Dad. I couldn't believe it. After 20 years of silence, he just pops back into my life like nothing ever happened? Like he didn't completely abandon us and leave my mom to raise me on her own? I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to delete the email, pretend I never saw it. But another part of me, the part that still carried around that little kid who just wanted to know why, was curious. What could he possibly have to say after all these years? I didn't respond right away. I needed time to think, to process everything. I didn't tell anyone about the email, not even my mom. I wasn't sure how she would react. She had worked so hard to move on from him, to build a life for us after he left. I didn't want to stir up old wounds. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed answers. I couldn't just let this go. I had to know why he left, why he stayed away for so long, and why now, after 2 decades, he suddenly wanted to reconnect. I decided to meet him. I thought about it for a few more days before finally responding. I kept my message short. I didn't want to sound too eager or emotional. Hey. I'm open to meeting. Let me know when and where. I left it at that, no pleasantries, no love you at the end. Just straight to the point. He responded almost immediately, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop downtown. It was a place I'd been to a few times, but the thought of sitting down with him there felt surreal. The day of the meetup, I was a wreck. I didn't know what to expect. Was he going to apologize? Try to explain himself? Would he act like nothing happened, like we could just pick up where we left off? I kept telling myself that I wasn't going to let him off easy, that I'd get my answers and then decide if I wanted him in my life. But deep down, I was nervous about what he'd say and how it would affect me. I got to the coffee shop early and grabbed a table near the back. I kept glancing at the door every time it opened, wondering if it was him. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't sit still. When he finally walked in, it was like time stopped for a second. He looked older than I remembered, obviously. His hair had turned gray, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. But he still had the same eyes, the same walk. For a second, it felt like I was 8 years old again, waiting for him to come home after work. He saw me, smiled awkwardly, and made his way over to the table. I stood up, not sure whether to shake his hand or hug him. I didn't. I just sat back down, and he followed suit. "Hey," he said, breaking the silence. "Hey." We both sat there for a minute, neither of us knowing how to start the conversation. The air was heavy with tension. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this. "I know this is probably really weird for you," he said, finally breaking the ice. "I mean, it's weird for me too. I've been thinking about you a lot over the years." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Thinking about me but not, reaching out? He winced at that, like my words had physically hurt him. "Yeah, I deserve that. Look, I know I screwed up. I know leaving like I did was the worst thing I could have done, and I've regretted it every day since." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "So why'd you do it?" He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "It's complicated." I could feel my anger bubbling up. I wasn't in the mood for some half-assed explanation. "Try me." He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Your mom and we were having problems. Money problems, mostly. But it was more than that. We just weren't happy. I was working all the time, trying to make enough to keep us afloat, and it felt like no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough. I felt like a failure." I clenched my jaw. "So instead of fixing things, you left?" He nodded, eyes still downcast. "Yeah, I did. I was scared. I didn't know how to handle everything, and instead of dealing with it like an adult, I ran. I thought I'd come back, eventually, when I got my life together. But then time just slipped away. Every day I didn't come back, it got harder to even think about it." I sat there, processing his words. It felt like a weak excuse. He left because things were hard? He didn't even try to make it work? "And what about me?" I asked, my voice tight with emotion. "Did you ever think about how your leaving would affect me?" I was just a kid. His face crumpled at that, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I thought about you every day, I swear. But I convinced myself that you were better off without me. That I'd just make things worse if I came back." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much his absence had hurt me, how many nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering what I did wrong. But another part of me, the part that had been carrying this anger for so long, felt tired. I didn't have the energy to hold on to that rage anymore. "So, why now?" I asked. "Why reach out after 20 years? He looked up at me, his eyes glistening. "I'm sick." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. For a second, I just sat there, my mind unable to process what he'd said. "Sick? What do you mean?" He took a deep breath before answering, his voice quieter now. "I've got cancer. Stage 3. They've been trying treatments, but it's not looking good." I felt my stomach drop. Cancer. I didn't know what to say. All the anger, all the resentment I'd been holding onto for years, suddenly felt different. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to deal with the possibility that my dad might die before we ever really had a chance to figure things out. "I'm not telling you this to get sympathy," he added quickly, noticing my silence. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything because of it. I didn't want to die without at least trying to make things right." I sat there, staring at him, my mind racing. It felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. For so long, my life had been defined by the fact that my dad had left. That had been the narrative. He abandoned us, and I grew up without him. And now, just when I was finally starting to confront that, to maybe get some answers, he drops this bombshell. "So, what, you want a second chance now? After 20 years of nothing? My voice came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't help it. He sighed. I don't know. I don't expect you to forgive me, or even to want a relationship with me. I didn't want to leave this world without at least trying to talk to you. Without you knowing that I regret everything. I felt the weight of his words, but I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my head, the one telling me that this was convenient for him. That he only came back now because he was sick, because he was scared of dying alone. It was hard to shake that feeling, that doubt. I looked down at my coffee cup, my fingers gripping it tightly. I don't know what you expect from me, I said quietly. I don't know how to just forget everything you did. I don't expect you to, he said softly. I don't. I just want to try. If you'll let me. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know how to. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me wanted to stand up and walk away, to tell him that he didn't get to waltz back into my life after all this time just because he was sick. But another part of me, the part that had always wondered, always longed for some kind of closure, was curious. Was it possible to move past everything? To at least try to rebuild something? I need time, I finally said. I can't just decide right now. He nodded, understanding. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, for now, at least. That last part hung in the air between us, a reminder of the ticking clock he was living with. I didn't know if I could handle that pressure, the idea that I might not have much time to figure things out. But I also didn't know if I could handle the regret if I didn't at least try. We sat there in silence for a few more minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, I stood up. I should go. He nodded again, looking down at his hands. Okay. I grabbed my jacket and turned to leave. But as I reached the door, I stopped. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned back around and looked at him. I'll call you, I said, my voice softer now. Just, give me some time. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. I'll be here, he said. I walked out of the coffee shop, my mind swirling with emotions. I felt like I was caught in the middle of a storm, unsure of which way to turn. Part of me wanted to never see him again, to go back to the way things were before he showed up. But another part of me, probably the part that had been hurt the most, wanted to see where this could go. Maybe I didn't need to forgive him completely, but maybe I could at least try to understand. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. His words kept playing in my head, over and over again. The regret in his voice, the sadness in his eyes. He seemed sincere, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was just because of his illness. Would he have reached out if he weren't sick? Or was this all just a last-ditch effort to clear his conscience? I didn't have answers, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. But eventually, I did pick up the phone and call him. We set up another meeting, this time at a park near my apartment. I figured it would be less intense than sitting in a coffee shop, surrounded by people. When I got there, he was already waiting on a bench, looking out at the pond. He smiled when he saw me, but it was a sad smile. He looked more tired than before, like the weight of everything was catching up to him. How are you feeling? I asked, sitting down next to him. He shrugged. Some days are better than others. I'm trying to stay positive, but you know how it is. I didn't, but I nodded anyway. We sat there for a while, not talking, just watching the ducks swim around the pond. It felt less awkward this time, like we were starting to settle into this strange new dynamic. After a while, he turned to me and asked, "Do you want to know more about what happened? About why I left?" I hesitated, but then I nodded. Yeah. I think I need to understand. He took a deep breath, staring out at the pond again, as if gathering his thoughts. It wasn't just one thing, he started, his voice quiet. I know it probably seemed like I just up and left, but there was a lot going on back then. Things I didn't know how to deal with. I stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to demand answers, but I knew this wasn't the time for that. I needed to hear him out, no matter how hard it was. I was young, he continued, and I was scared. Your mom and we had problems long before I left. We were fighting a lot, mostly about money, but other things too. I felt like I couldn't do anything right, like I was failing as a husband and a father. And instead of trying to work through it, I just ran. I felt a pang of anger rise up in me. Running away? That's how he justified abandoning us? But I bit my tongue, letting him finish. I didn't know how to handle the pressure, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. Your mom was always stronger than me. She was the rock, and I was the one who crumbled under the weight of it all. And when things got tough, I made the worst decision of my life. I left. He paused, glancing over at me. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I know I should have stayed, I should have fought for you and your mom. But at the time, I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me. That I was just making everything worse by being there. I couldn't hold back anymore. You think leaving was better? I snapped, my voice shaking with emotion. You think abandoning your family made things easier for us? Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without you? Watching mom struggle to keep things together, trying to be both parents because you were too scared to stay? He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. You're right, he said softly. I wasn't there for you, and I know I caused a lot of pain. I can't take that back. I wish I could, but I can't. All I can do is try to make up for it now, in whatever way you'll let me. I shook my head, my emotions swirling inside me. It's not that simple. You don't just get to show up and say sorry and expect everything to be okay. You weren't there for my childhood. You missed everything. Birthdays, graduations, all of it. And now you want a second chance? After 20 years? I know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I know I don't deserve it. But I had to try. I had to at least see if there was any way to rebuild something, even if it's just a little. We sat there in silence again, the tension between us thick and heavy. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so many years imagining what it would be like if my dad ever came back, if he ever tried to explain himself. And now that it was happening, I felt more confused than ever. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added after a moment. I don't expect that. But maybe, just maybe, we can start over in some small way. I don't want to leave this world without trying to fix at least some of the damage I've caused. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the pain in his eyes. The guilt, the regret. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it made me realize that maybe he had been carrying his own burden all these years. Maybe he wasn't just the villain I'd always painted him to be. I don't know if I can do that, I admitted, my voice shaky. I don't know if I can just let go of everything and start over. He nodded, as if he understood. I don't expect you to. But if you ever feel like you're ready to try, I'll be here. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. But at least now, I had some of the answers I'd been searching for. He wasn't some heartless monster who abandoned us without a second thought. He was just a flawed person who made a terrible mistake, a mistake that had cost us both so much. We spent the next few minutes sitting in silence, watching the ducks paddle around the pond. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't as tense as before either. It felt like we were both processing everything that had just been said, trying to figure out where to go from here. I should probably get going, I finally said, standing up. I've got a lot to think about. He nodded and stood up too. Take your time. I'll be here whenever you're ready. I wasn't sure if I would ever be ready, but I appreciated the offer. For now, I needed space. I needed to figure out how I really felt about everything. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and maybe even a little bit of hope. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. His words, his explanations, his regret. It was hard to reconcile the image of the man who had left us with the man I'd seen at the park, the man who was clearly hurting, just like I was. But even so, the pain of his absence was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. A few weeks went by, and I didn't reach out to him. I wasn't ready. But then one day, I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, it was my dad's voice on the other end, and he sounded different. Weak, tired. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to let you know that I'm going into the hospital for some tests. They're saying it doesn't look good, but I didn't want to leave without talking to you one more time." My heart sank. I knew this day would come eventually, but I hadn't expected it to come so soon. Part of me wanted to hang up the phone and pretend I didn't hear what he said. But another part of me, maybe the part that still cared, told me to go see him. "I'll be there," I said quietly, before hanging up the phone. When I arrived at the hospital, I wasn't sure what to expect. My mind was racing, filled with questions and emotions I hadn't fully worked through. I hadn't spoken to anyone about my dad's sudden reappearance in my life, not even my mom. It just felt too complicated to explain, and honestly, I wasn't sure how she'd react if she knew I was here. As I walked through the sterile hallways, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air, I found myself growing more and more anxious. What if this was my last chance to see him? What if I hadn't worked through my anger enough to handle this? I was still so torn between resentment and a desire for closure, and now it felt like time was slipping through my fingers. When I finally found his room, I hesitated outside the door. I could hear the faint beeping of machines inside, a sound that made everything feel more real. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. There he was, lying in a hospital bed, looking smaller and frilier than I had ever seen him. His skin was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. It was a stark contrast to the man I'd confronted at the park just a few weeks ago. Seeing him like this, vulnerable and weak, made my heart ache in a way I hadn't expected. "Hey," he said softly when he saw me, a small smile forming on his lips. His voice was raspy, and it was clear that he was struggling to muster the energy to speak. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." "I almost didn't," I admitted, pulling a chair over to his bedside. "But here I am." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and sadness. "I'm glad you did. There's a lot I still want to say, and I don't know how much time I have left." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear more, but I knew I had to. This might be the last chance I had to understand the man who had caused me so much pain. "The doctors say it's cancer," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Stage 4. It's in my lungs and has spread to other parts of my body. They're not sure how long I have, but it's not looking good." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what he was saying. Cancer. Of all the things I'd imagined could happen, this wasn't one of them. And now, faced with the reality of losing him again, this time for good, I didn't know how to feel. "I know I don't deserve your sympathy," he said after a moment, his eyes searching mine. "I know I hurt you and your mom in ways I can never make up for. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I've carried that guilt with me every day for the past 20 years, and it's eaten away at me. I just didn't have the courage to face it until now." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, I realized that maybe he was hurting too. Not in the same way I was, but in his own way. And that guilt, that regret, had probably shaped him just as much as his absence had shaped me. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "But I think I understand you a little more now." He smiled weakly, his eyes filling with tears. "That's all I can ask for. Just, thank you for giving me this chance, even if it's too late to make things right." We sat there for a while in silence, the beeping of the machines the only sound in the room. I wasn't sure what to say or how to feel. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but I knew that wasn't true. And I wasn't ready to offer that kind of peace yet, even if I could feel some of my anger slipping away. "I don't want to leave you with nothing," he said after a long pause. "I've spent the last few years trying to rebuild my life, trying to atone for what I did. I've saved up some money, and I want you to have it. It's not much, but it's something. Maybe it can help with something important in your life. I looked at him, surprised by his offer. Money? After all these years, he thought money could somehow make up for what he'd done? I wasn't sure how to feel about it, but I could see that this was his way of trying to make amends. It wasn't enough to fix the past, but maybe it was his way of offering a small piece of redemption. I don't need your money, I said, my voice firm. That's not what this is about. I know, he replied, his voice soft and tired. But I want you to have it anyway. It's the least I can do. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say. All I knew was that sitting here, watching my dad in this hospital bed, I felt more conflicted than ever. I had spent so many years hating him, imagining what I would say if I ever saw him again. But now that I was here, all of that anger felt so far away. In its place was a kind of sadness that I hadn't expected, a sadness for everything we had lost and everything we would never get back. I'm tired, he said after a while, closing his eyes. I think I need to rest for a bit. Okay, I whispered, standing up from my chair. I'll come back tomorrow. He nodded weakly, his eyes still closed. Thank you. As I left the hospital, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't walk away from this without at least trying to find some kind of closure. Maybe that meant forgiving my dad, or maybe it just meant coming to terms with everything that had happened. Either way, I wasn't ready to let go just yet. The next day, I found myself back at the hospital. This time, I brought a cup of coffee with me, though it did little to calm the nerves buzzing inside me. I spent the drive over replaying everything that had happened in my head, the apology, the mention of cancer, the offer of money. It was still a lot to take in, and I hadn't fully wrapped my head around it yet. I walked into his room, half expecting the same weak man I saw the day before. But to my surprise, he was sitting up in bed, looking a little more alert. His color hadn't returned, but there was something more lively about him, like he was fighting to hold on to the last bit of energy he had. Morning, I greeted him quietly, unsure of how to start after our heavy conversation the day before. Morning, he replied with a small smile. I wasn't sure if you'd come back. I sat down beside him, setting the coffee down on the small table. Yeah, well, I still have some questions. He nodded, his expression growing serious. I figured you would. There was so much I wanted to ask, but I didn't know where to start. My mind jumped from topic to topic, each one more emotionally charged than the last. I needed to know why he had left, why he had never tried to come back, why he had let us believe he was gone for good. But I also knew that pressing him too hard might send him back into the same shell he had been living in for the past 20 years. I want to understand why you left, I finally said, my voice quiet but firm. Not just some vague explanation, but the real reason. I need to know. He took a deep breath, looking down at his hands. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer, that he would dodge the question like he had dodged responsibility for so long. But then he sighed and began to speak. It wasn't just one thing, he said slowly, his voice filled with a kind of regret that made my chest tighten. It was everything. The pressure, the fear, the feeling that I wasn't good enough for you and your mom. I felt like I was suffocating, like no matter what I did, I couldn't get it right. And instead of facing those feelings, I ran. I sat there, absorbing his words. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him that his fear and insecurity didn't justify abandoning his family. But another part of me understood. I had felt that same fear in my own life, the fear of not being enough, of failing the people I cared about. It didn't excuse what he had done, but maybe it explained it in a way I hadn't expected. I convinced myself that you were better off without me, he continued, his eyes still fixed on his hands. That if I wasn't there, you and your mom would be free from the burden of dealing with me. But looking back, I know that was just an excuse. I was scared, and I took the easy way out. I didn't know what to say. His confession felt raw, like he was finally peeling back the layers of guilt and shame he had been carrying for so long. But it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. You could have come back, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You could have tried. I know, he replied, his voice breaking slightly. I know I could have. And I wish I had. But once I left, it felt like there was no going back. I was too ashamed to face you and your mom, too scared of what you'd say or how you'd react. So I stayed away, convincing myself it was for the best. I felt a lump forming in my throat, my emotions swirling together in a mix of anger and sadness. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that he had made that choice for us, that he had decided we were better off without him without even giving us a say. And now, after all these years, I was left to pick up the pieces of a relationship that never had a chance to grow. But I thought about you every day, he said, his voice trembling. I kept up with you from a distance, watching you grow up, seeing you become the person you are today. And every time I saw you, I wanted to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too afraid of how much I had hurt you. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the one I had spent my whole life hating. He had stayed away out of fear, out of a twisted sense of self-preservation. It didn't make what he did right, but it added another layer of complexity to the story I had always told myself. I didn't need you to be perfect, I said after a long pause. I just needed you to be there. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. I know. And I'm sorry. The room was quiet for a while after that, the weight of our conversation settling between us. I wasn't sure where we went from here. There was so much to unpack, so much pain and resentment that couldn't be erased with a single apology. But at the same time, I felt like we were finally getting somewhere, like maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said eventually, my voice steady but soft. Not yet, anyway. But I think I'm willing to try. He nodded, his eyes misting over. That's more than I deserve. We sat in silence for a while longer, the tension in the air slowly beginning to fade. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, like we were finally having a real conversation instead of dancing around the truth. I'm not expecting us to be okay overnight, he said after a while. I know it's going to take time. But I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere this time. Whatever happens, I'm ready to face it with you. I nodded, my heart still heavy but a little lighter than it had been before. There was still so much left unsaid, so much I needed to process. But for now, this was enough. We had taken the first step, and that was more than I had ever thought possible. The days following that conversation with my dad were weird. I kept replaying everything he said in my head, the emotions cycling through like a broken record. There was the anger, the sadness, the confusion, and most surprisingly, the glimmer of hope. A part of me felt lighter, like maybe we were finally starting to heal something that had been broken for so long. But another part of me was skeptical, like I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. My mom, however, had no such hesitations. She made it very clear that she wanted nothing to do with my dad and his sudden reappearance in our lives. It wasn't just about what he did to her, it was the effect his leaving had on me, on us. She couldn't let that go. I'm glad you're talking to him, she said one afternoon when we were having lunch together. But just be careful, okay? People don't change overnight. I know, Mom, I replied, even though I wasn't entirely sure if I believed that. But I have to see this through. I need answers, closure, whatever this is. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes softening. I get that, sweetie. Just don't let him hurt you again. Her words stuck with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go down this road, even if it led to more pain. I owed it to myself to confront this chapter of my life that I had buried for so long. Over the next few weeks, I visited my dad regularly. Our conversations became easier, though they were never without some level of tension. He shared more about his life, what he had been doing for the last 20 years, and why he had stayed away. It was a strange mix of mundane details and heavy emotions. He hadn't started a new family or moved far away like I had sometimes feared. Instead, he had just drifted from one town to another, taking odd jobs and never staying anywhere too long. It was hard to reconcile the man in front of me with the larger-than-life figure I had built up in my head over the years. In my imagination, he had always been this looming presence, either as the villain who abandoned us or as the man who might have saved us if only he had stayed. But in reality, he was just a flawed human being, stumbling through life and making bad decisions along the way. I never stopped thinking about you, he told me one day, his voice thick with emotion. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that. I believe you, I replied, surprising myself with how much I meant it. But it still doesn't take away the fact that you weren't there. I know, he said, looking down at his hands. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. The more we talked, the more I realized that there wasn't going to be some magical moment where everything made sense. There wasn't going to be a clear answer to why he left or why he stayed away. It was a messy, complicated situation, and the only way forward was through it. But as the weeks went by, something unexpected happened. I found myself starting to care about him again. It wasn't like the switch had been flipped, but I could feel the walls I had built around my heart starting to crack, bit by bit. He was still my dad, after all. And despite everything, a part of me wanted to believe that we could have some kind of relationship, even if it wasn't the one I had imagined growing up. Then, one day, he dropped a bombshell. I'm dying, he said, his voice steady but sad. The cancer, it's spreading faster than the doctors thought. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What? But you, how bad is it? He looked at me with those same regretful eyes, the weight of his words settling between us like a heavy fog. I don't have much time left. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything we had been building toward, all the fragile progress we had made, it suddenly seemed so small in the face of this news. I had always known, on some level, that he wasn't going to be around forever. But hearing it from his own mouth, knowing that our time together was even more limited than I thought, it hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice shaking. I didn't want to burden you with it, he said quietly. I know I've already put you through so much. I wanted these last few weeks to be about us, not my illness. I didn't know what to say. Anger, sadness, and guilt churned inside me, but mostly, I just felt numb. He had dropped this bombshell on me, and now I was left to figure out how to process it. All the questions I had about our past, all the resentment I still carried, it suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the reality that he was dying. What do you want me to do with this? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to handle this. I don't expect you to handle it, he said softly. I just wanted you to know. You deserve to know. The room fell into silence after that, both of us sitting there, lost in our own thoughts. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to jump or turn back. Everything felt so uncertain, so fragile. And I didn't know how to move forward from here. After that revelation, everything changed. Our already fragile connection now felt like it was on borrowed time, and every conversation, every interaction, carried the weight of finality. My dad's health began to deteriorate faster than either of us expected. One week, he seemed fine and tired but still able to hold a conversation, and the next, he was in and out of the hospital, barely able to speak. I was stuck in this strange limbo between trying to salvage what little time we had left and still processing all the unresolved issues from our past. It was a painful balancing act, and some days, I wasn't sure I could handle it. I tried to keep my life going as normally as possible, work, friends, my usual routines, but every time I was alone, the weight of my dad's situation came crashing down. I found myself replaying memories of my childhood, both the good and the bad. The few happy moments I had with him before he left were now tainted by the years of abandonment and the confusion that came with trying to reconcile the man I knew back then with the person he was now. But more than anything, I couldn't stop thinking about the future. Or rather, the lack of one. We were running out of time, and I wasn't sure if we had done enough to repair the damage between us. Part of me wondered if it was even possible to fix something that had been broken for so long. My mom, on the other hand, stayed distant. I didn't tell her about my dad's illness right away. I wasn't sure how she would react or if she would even care. But when I finally did tell her, she surprised me. I'm sorry to hear that, she said quietly, her face softening. I never wanted him to suffer, despite everything. I nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't like my mom to express sympathy for my dad, especially after all the pain he had caused us. But I think, in her own way, she was trying to let go of some of the anger she had held onto for so long. "Are you going to see him?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been visiting him a lot, but it's getting harder. I don't know how much longer he'll be around." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Do what you need to do, honey. Just don't let him take any more from you than he already has." Her words stuck with me, and over the next few weeks, I tried to navigate the complicated emotions that came with seeing my dad in his weakened state. He was still the same man who had left us all those years ago, but now, there was a vulnerability to him that I had never seen before. One afternoon, as I sat by his bedside in the hospital, he turned to me and said something that caught me completely off guard. "I wish I had been a better father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I had stayed." It took me a moment to respond. "You can't change the past," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know," he sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "But I think about it every day. How different things could have been." For the first time in my life, I saw real regret in his eyes. Not just the surface-level apologies he had given me before, but deep, painful regret. And while a part of me wanted to hold on to my anger, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. He wasn't just the man who had left us, he was also the man who had to live with the consequences of that decision for the rest of his life. "I'd made my peace with it," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "I'm still angry, but I'm trying to let it go." He nodded weakly, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the water next to his bed. "I'm sorry," he repeated, as if those two words could somehow erase 20 years of pain. "I know," I replied, my heart aching. There was a long silence after that, neither of us knowing what to say. What more could we say? We were two people who had been shaped by years of distance and abandonment, trying to find a way to reconnect in the face of an uncertain future. As the weeks passed, my dad's condition worsened. The doctors gave him less and less time, and I found myself bracing for the inevitable. Every visit felt heavier, like we were approaching some final moment that I wasn't ready for. And then, one morning, I got the call. The hospital told me that my dad had passed away during the night. It was peaceful, they said. He had gone quietly, without any pain. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. The man who had caused me so much pain was gone. And with him, all the questions, the unresolved issues, and the hope for some kind of closure. I went to the hospital to collect his things, a few clothes, some personal items, nothing of great significance. As I stood in his now empty room, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, yes, but also relief. Relief that the uncertainty was over, that I no longer had to navigate the complicated relationship we had been trying to rebuild. But mostly, I felt a sense of loss. Not just for my dad, but for the relationship we never got to have. The one I had always dreamed of as a kid, the one where he stayed, where he was there for me when I needed him. That relationship was gone now, and with it, the chance for any real resolution. I left the hospital that day feeling like a part of me had been closed off forever. My dad was gone, and with him, the final chapter of our story. But as I drove home, I realized something important: it wasn't the end of my story. I still had a life to live, and I wasn't going to let his absence define me anymore. In the days following my dad's passing, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. Not the kind of raw, all-consuming grief that you see in movies, but more of a hollow, lingering feeling that gnawed at me in quiet moments. It wasn't like I had just lost someone who had been a constant in my life for years, far from it. My dad had been gone for so long that, in many ways, I had already grieved him years ago. But this was different. This was the finality of it. He wasn't coming back this time, and there would be no more half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, no more painful conversations trying to untangle the past. It was just over. I had always imagined that when this moment came, I would feel a sense of relief, like some huge burden had been lifted off my shoulders. And while there was a part of me that did feel lighter, there was also a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. It was like all the unresolved pain and anger I had carried with me for years suddenly had nowhere to go. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by my dad's absence, by the anger I felt toward him for abandoning us, and now that he was gone for good, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be anymore. The funeral was a small, quiet affair. Just a handful of people, mostly distant relatives and a few old friends of my dad's that I had never met before. It was surreal, standing there in the funeral home, surrounded by people who seemed to know more about the man my dad had become in the years after he left than I did. I felt like a stranger at my own father's funeral. My mom didn't come. I hadn't expected her to, but it still stung a little. Despite everything that had happened between them, I had hoped that she might show up, even if it was just for my sake. But she stayed home, and I couldn't blame her. She had made her peace with my dad a long time ago, in her own way. As I stood there, listening to the priest say a few words about my dad's life, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. Not just from the service, but from the whole story of his life. There was so much that had gone unsaid between us, so much left unresolved. I wondered if anyone else standing there had the same sense of unfinished business with him, or if I was the only one carrying that weight. After the service, a few people came up to me to offer their condolences. Most of them didn't know me, they only knew of me as Tom's son, the kid he had left behind all those years ago. They said the usual things people say at funerals: "He was a good man, he loved you, I'm sure he's in a better place now." I nodded politely, but the words felt hollow. How could they know what kind of man he was to me when they didn't even know who he was? One older woman, who I later found out had been a close friend of my dad's in his later years, approached me with a soft, understanding smile. "Your father talked about you all the time," she said, her voice gentle. "He was so proud of you." I didn't know what to say to that. Proud? My dad barely knew me. How could he be proud of someone he had barely been a part of? But I nodded again, offering a small, forced smile. It wasn't the time or place to challenge her words. After the funeral, I stayed behind for a while, alone in the small, quiet cemetery. It was a sunny day, the kind of day that felt too cheerful for a funeral. I stared at my dad's freshly covered grave, trying to process everything that had happened over the past few months. His illness, our attempts to reconnect, his death, it all felt like a blur. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried once since he passed. Maybe I had cried enough over the years that I didn't have any tears left for him now. Or maybe I was still too numb to feel anything real. I wasn't sure. As I stood there, I realized that this was it. This was the end of our story. There would be no more chances to fix what had been broken between us. No more conversations, no more apologies, no more anything. I would never get the closure I had been searching for, and I had to learn to live with that. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work and tried to distract myself from the grief that I still didn't fully understand. My friends checked in on me, offering their support, but I found it hard to explain what I was going through. It wasn't like the typical loss of a parent. My dad had been gone for so long that, in many ways, I didn't even know how to grieve him now. It felt like I was mourning not just his death, but the loss of the relationship we never had, the father I never got to know. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a package in the mail. It was from my dad's lawyer, a small box containing a few of his personal belongings that had been left to me. There wasn't much in it, just a few old photos, a watch, and a letter. The letter was short, only a few lines, but it was enough to break through the wall of numbness I had been hiding behind. "I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could have been the father you deserved. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me one day. Love, Dad." I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands trembling. I had waited so long to hear those words, but now that I had them, they didn't feel like enough. They couldn't undo the years of pain, the years of wondering why he had left, the years of trying to figure out what I had done wrong. But they were something. And in a way, they were the closest thing to closure I was ever going to get. After reading the letter, I felt a flood of emotions that I hadn't expected. Anger, sadness, relief, it was all there, swirling together in a confusing mess. My dad's apology felt too little, too late. But at the same time, it was the first real acknowledgement I had ever gotten from him about the pain he had caused. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the letter, trying to make sense of everything. I had spent so much of my life wishing for this moment, imagining what it would be like to finally hear him say he was sorry. But now that it had happened, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Part of me wanted to rip the letter up, throw it away, and forget about it. It felt unfair that he could just write a few words and expect everything to be okay. But another part of me, the part that still held on to some small sliver of hope, wanted to keep it, to hold on to it as proof that maybe, in the end, he had cared after all. In the end, I carefully folded the letter and put it back in the box with the rest of his things. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Not yet. The following weeks were a strange mix of normalcy and emotional upheaval. On the outside, I went about my life as usual, going to work, hanging out with friends, doing all the things that kept me grounded. But on the inside, I was still processing everything that had happened with my dad. I kept replaying our last conversations in my head, wondering if there was something more I could have done, something I should have said. I kept coming back to the same question: why had he left in the first place? And why, after all those years, had he decided to come back? I didn't have any answers, and it frustrated me to no end. The letter had given me a small piece of closure, but it wasn't enough. There was still so much I didn't understand. One night, a few weeks after the funeral, I decided to visit my mom. We hadn't talked much about my dad since he passed, and I knew she was probably dealing with her own complicated feelings about the whole thing. I wanted to see how she was doing, but I also had questions that only she could answer. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with a warm smile, but I could see the tiredness in her eyes. She had aged a lot over the years, and I realized just how much of a toll my dad's abandonment had taken on her. She had been strong for so long, holding our family together when everything fell apart, but now that he was gone for good, I wondered if she finally felt the weight of it all catching up with her. We sat in the living room, sipping tea in comfortable silence for a while. I wasn't sure how to bring up the subject of my dad, so I waited, hoping she might say something first. Eventually, she sighed and set her cup down. "I've been thinking about your father a lot lately," she said, her voice quiet. "Me too," I admitted. "There's still so much I don't understand, Mom. Why did he leave us? And why did he come back after all those years?" She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood up and walked over to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. She pulled out an old photo album and brought it over to me, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for. She pointed to a picture of my dad, taken when I was just a baby. He was smiling, holding me in his arms, and for a moment, I barely recognized him. He looked so different from the man I had known in my later years, so much happier, more carefree. "Your father loved you," she said, her voice soft. "He loved both of us. But he wasn't strong enough to handle the responsibilities of being a husband and a father. He had his demons, and in the end, they got the better of him." I frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "What do you mean? What kind of demons?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Your father struggled with addiction, sweetheart. He was good at hiding it for a long time, but eventually, it became too much. He couldn't handle the pressure, and he started pulling away from us. I tried to help him, but, in the end, he chose to leave." I stared at her, my mind racing. Addiction? I had never known that about my dad. He had never mentioned it, not even once. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to carry the burden of his mistakes," she said gently. "You were just a child, and I wanted to protect you from the worst of it. But now that he's gone, I think it's important for you to know the truth." I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything she had just told me. It was like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place, explaining so much about my dad's behavior over the years. The distance, the erratic communication, the sudden disappearance, it all made sense now. He had been fighting a battle I hadn't even known about, and in the end, he had lost. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. "Did he ever try to get better?" I asked, my voice tight with emotion. My mom nodded. "He went to rehab a few times, but it never stuck. He was always chasing something, trying to fill a void that nothing seemed to satisfy. And eventually, he just gave up. I felt a lump forming in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. It was hard to hear all of this, to realize that my dad had been carrying so much pain and that I had been completely unaware of it. I wish I had known, I said quietly. Maybe I could have helped him. My mom reached over and placed her hand on mine. It wasn't your responsibility, honey. Your father made his choices, and nothing you could have done would have changed that. You were just a kid, you shouldn't have had to deal with any of it. I nodded, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed my chance to really know my dad. He had been fighting his own demons, but I had been fighting my own battles too, the battle of growing up without him, of trying to make sense of his absence. And now that he was gone, I would never get the opportunity to ask him the questions that had haunted me for years. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting more on my mom's revelations about my dad. The knowledge that he had struggled with addiction was a heavy burden, but it also brought a new level of understanding. I had always blamed him for leaving us, but now I saw that there was more to the story, an illness that had driven him away. But understanding didn't necessarily mean forgiving. I still felt a deep sense of betrayal, and the idea of him trying to come back into my life after all these years stirred up a whirlwind of emotions. It wasn't just about his departure, it was about the missed moments, the lost years, and the impact his absence had on my family. A few weeks after our conversation, I received a call from my dad's lawyer. He wanted to discuss the arrangements for the estate and any legal matters that needed to be addressed. I had been dreading this call, but I knew it was something I had to handle. The meeting was set for the following week, and I spent the days leading up to it in a state of anxious anticipation. I wondered what kind of legacy my dad had left behind. Would there be anything of value, or would it be just a few personal items and a pile of legal paperwork? When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the lawyer's office with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The office was neatly organized, with shelves full of legal books and framed diplomas on the walls. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, and he greeted me with a polite nod as I took a seat. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for meeting with me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," he replied, flipping through a file on his desk. "I'm here to go over your father's estate and any related matters. I know this can be a difficult time, so I'll do my best to make this process as smooth as possible." He began by outlining the details of my dad's will. It turned out that he had left behind a modest estate, some savings, a few pieces of furniture, and a couple of sentimental items. There was also a small trust fund that had been set up for me, but it wasn't anything substantial. As Mr. Thompson explained the details, I found myself struggling to stay focused. My mind kept drifting back to my dad's absence and the fact that, despite everything, he had still managed to leave something behind. It felt surreal, like he had tried to make amends in some small way, even if it was too little too late. When the meeting was over, I walked out of the lawyer's office feeling emotionally drained. The weight of my dad's absence seemed heavier than ever, and the knowledge that there was no way to get those lost years back only added to the sense of loss. Over the next few weeks, I sorted through the items from the estate and tried to make sense of what to do with them. There were old photographs, letters, and a few personal belongings that I wasn't sure if I should keep or donate. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a life that I had never fully understood. One day, while going through some of the old letters, I came across a note addressed to me. It was written in my dad's handwriting, and it was clear that it had been written a long time ago. My heart raced as I opened it, wondering what kind of message he had left behind. The letter was a heartfelt apology, much like the one I had received earlier, but it also included a few personal reflections. He talked about his regrets, his struggles, and his hopes for me. He acknowledged that he had made mistakes, but he also expressed his love and wished me well. Reading the letter brought a fresh wave of emotions. It was clear that my dad had tried to reach out to me, even if he hadn't been able to do so in person. It was both comforting and heartbreaking to know that he had cared, but it didn't change the fact that he had been absent for most of my life. I decided to keep the letter and put it in a safe place. It was a tangible reminder of the complexity of our relationship, a mixture of love and pain that had defined my memories of him. As I continued to sort through his belongings and reflect on everything that had happened, I realized that the journey of coming to terms with my dad's departure and return was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions and unresolved feelings. I knew that I had to take things one step at a time and allow myself the space to process everything. My dad's return had opened up old wounds, but it had also given me an opportunity to find closure, even if it was a difficult and ongoing process. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I was determined to face it with the understanding that, in the end, my dad's actions had been driven by his own struggles and regrets. And while I couldn't change the past, I could choose how to move forward and find my own path to healing. As the weeks turned into months, I continued to grapple with the complexities of my dad's return into my life. I had made some decisions about the estate, including donating most of the personal items to charity. The photos and letters were stored away, kept for reflection but not a daily reminder of his absence. The most challenging part was dealing with my emotions. I started attending therapy sessions to help me navigate the complicated feelings that came with my dad's sudden reappearance. Talking through the pain, anger, and confusion was cathartic and helped me gain perspective. I decided to meet with my dad once more. This time, I felt more prepared. I wanted to understand him better, hear his side of the story, and, most importantly, communicate my own feelings and boundaries clearly. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop where we could talk without the pressure of being at either of our homes. When I walked in, he was already seated, looking nervous but hopeful. I took a deep breath and approached the table. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual but finding it difficult to hide the tension in my voice. "Hey," he replied, standing up to give me a hesitant hug. I returned it, but it felt more like a formality than an expression of affection. We sat down and started talking. My dad shared more about his struggles with addiction, his time in rehab, and the steps he had taken to turn his life around. He talked about how he had always wanted to reconnect but felt ashamed and afraid of reaching out. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I wanted you to know that I've been working on myself and trying to make things right, even if it's too late." I listened, trying to keep an open mind. I asked questions about his recovery and how he planned to move forward. I also made it clear that while I appreciated his efforts to change, I needed time and space to process everything. Rebuilding our relationship wouldn't happen overnight, and I needed to prioritize my own healing. "I understand," he said, nodding. "I'm not asking for anything more than a chance to be part of your life, even if it's just in a small way." We left the coffee shop with a tentative agreement to keep in touch and update each other on significant events. I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. It was a step toward reconciliation, but it was also a reminder of the unresolved feelings I still carried. In the months that followed, our communication remained sporadic. We exchanged occasional messages and updates, and I started to see glimpses of the person he was trying to become. It was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the pain of the past. I continued to focus on my own growth and healing. I worked on strengthening my relationships with the people who had been there for me all along and tried to find balance in my life. The journey of coming to terms with my dad's return was ongoing, and I knew that it would take time to fully process the impact of his absence and re-entry into my life. But I also recognized that I had taken significant steps toward understanding and forgiveness, and that was something I could be proud of. In the end, the experience taught me a lot about resilience, forgiveness, and the complexities of family relationships. It was a reminder that life is full of unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes the best we can do is take each day as it comes, with an open heart and a willingness to heal.